Hey, everybody. Welcome to the DC Special Podcast brought to you by Rolled Spine. I'm Blue Machine. With me is...
Diabolu Frank.
And...
Miss Fixit.
And so here's why I brought us all together today, gentlemen. So there's a lot of news about specifically Detective Comics since the turn of the year, right? So we had, like, the whole breakup with Diamond, and then Dan Didio left, and then last week they laid off, like, a third editorial staff, and then their DC Direct got killed in the same announcement, and then you find out that their streaming service they'd been kind of hyping, they're killing altogether, they're rolling into HBO Max. So I was sitting here like trying to sort through this shit, and they're talking to Jim Lee, and Jim Lee's like, no, everything's fine, comic books are good, we're going to continue to make comic books. So I asked myself, I was like, what the fuck is going on? I need to ask the most extremely jaded comic collector / retailer who is extremely biased on everything having to do with the comic book industry to find out what exactly is going on, and frankly, get to the bottom of this. You guys know what I'm saying here? I want to get to the bottom of it. So I sent an old Twitter message to my friend Diabolu Frank here, and I was like, dude, I need you to explain this to me like I am a child, because I am. And I don't understand, is what's going on good, bad, terrible? Possibly, was it just
apocalyptic?
Predictable? Is it apocalyptic, or is it just frankly compartment or downsizing, bloated staff?
What do you call it? Reshuffling
or since they were acquired by AT&T and Warner Brothers, was this just going to naturally happen? You got too many.
They need to realign the synergy.
Yeah. Let's do that. We got to get some. We have to realign our synergies, as Mr. Fixit there said. Is that what's going on, or is this just basically they're going to kill comic books and make the occasional video
the way
game?
Of the Malibu comic.
The second one.
Well, I don't know. Okay, so break it down, Frank. Go, Frank. Go.
Well, do we want to Okay, I feel like I'm going to end up talking. Yeah, I feel like I'm going to be talking for a long time, so I think that maybe a little bit more open discussion before I really go into a deep dive. Mr. Fixit, what do you know about things? Have you kept up with any of the stuff that's been going on?
It was like the Valentine massacre at DC is all I know. What I read was a bunch of Marvel people saying, even though we're competitors, we don't ever want to see. I don't know. I just heard like all these dudes at DC just got wiped out, and that's all I know. Mostly editorial, right?
Yeah, but I mean, if you don't have people editing books, then you don't have books. So
true.
It's sort of a trickle down.
They wiped out, like I heard about how, because we all knew that the DC app was not going to survive because they were moving all the shows over to either the WB or HBO Max. So I had a sneaking suspicion that app wasn't going to last very long already, but I didn't know about this whole comic books. I don't know. Like I really don't know. I'm kind of like Mac. I'm a bit in the dark. I follow the only information I have is from Eric Larson, who talked about it somewhat, but even they were all kind of cryptic about it, like more writer talk, like they were kind of talking to each other and not directly saying, oh, this is why it's happening. So you tell me, Frank.
Well, one of the people that talks about comics a lot that's on the internet is Grace Randolph. You may remember her. She used to have the videos on Bleeding Cool, Think About the Ink. And before that, she used to be at Marvel and then Marvel Candor. I never could stand her. I didn't like her voice. And she really has sort of a weird, like sort of comic skatey vibe to her. And she did an explanation video that ran for like 20 minutes or so. And it's weird to me because this is a person that kind of got her start doing comic book news, and that's where she built her name and stuff. And to be speaking so cavalierly about all these people losing their jobs in the midst of a pandemic just was really stomach turning to me. And so one of the reasons why when Mac suggested this that I wanted to take part was just because I looked at a lot of the explainer videos I've got out there, and it's almost always Comicsgate or Comicsgate adjacent type people who are just like gleeful, like delightful of this happening, or they're speaking out about it in very callous terms. And I wanted to come at it, astonishingly for me, from a slightly more empathetic place. They're calling it the DC Bloodbath. Basically what I think the reason why that was the case is that Heidi McDonald is one of the main journalists in comics, one of the people who actually like tracks down stories and acts like a reporter. And multiple sources that she spoke to early on at DC Comics was referring to it as a bloodbath, and that just sort of got picked up, and most of the media coverage goes to that. And a lot of it, I think, goes back to the DC implosion. Do you guys remember anything about that?
No. When was this? No. Give me a time frame.
So this was back in the 70s. And so basically what had happened is DC was fighting with Marvel for market share back when the newsstand was still the main place to get your books. And so they were trying to push each other off the stands by just producing a whole bunch of material. There was also the deal where I think paper costs were rising, and there was a demand from the newsstand to have more expensive books. Basically, comic book industry had tried to keep the price down as low as possible and kept making comic books thinner and thinner and less of a value because they felt like the price point was the most important thing about what they produced, and they had to keep it at like a dime, a quarter, a price that a kid could afford, pocket change, something that's so frivolous that nobody would refuse them this small amount of money to keep themselves going. And they actually ended up hurting themselves, which is not an uncommon thing in comics, where you've got people who don't have the right mentality to be really commercially successful, they had gotten the price point so low that because comic books still, by their dimensions, took up so much space. You have a box of nickel candy, or you have racks of comic books, and they're not that far apart in price. You'd rather just have more space for the nickel candy instead of all this space for comics. And so DC tried to make up for that by coming up with things like 100-page giants for $1 comics and stuff. And so there was this glut of comics, and then this one year there was a really bad blizzard, and it basically prevented the comic books from moving around, or it prevented people from getting to the newsstand to buy the comics. And so they had all these returns, all these unsold comics. So they went from what they called the DC explosion, where they were putting out all this new material and trying all this new novel approaches and just every genre under the world, and reprints at a time. And the only way you could never see Golden Age books, any venue, so they were giving it to you as a bonus with the regular comic. That just got wiped out. And so this is the closest approximation to that DC implosion, where a substantial portion of the line was cut. There were books that were produced in that time period that have never been properly published, and DC took years to try to recover from this. And so I think that's where the naming convention comes from, is they got a DC explosion, a DC implosion, now they've got the DC bloodbath. And given that I'm a Bloodlines fan, and I had a blog and occasionally a podcast called DC Bloodlines, which ended in the book DC Bloodbath, it feels like we're almost uniquely situated to discuss this particular matter. And this is very similar to that. It's weird because we're talking about the end of DC Comics and the end of the comic industry, and it's bizarre partially because this should have happened already a long time ago. And you really have to go back to the origins of DC Comics. The company is founded by Major Malcolm William Nicholson, and his daughter, not his daughter, like a granddaughter, maybe even a great-granddaughter. She's actually putting out a book, and I don't think it's been released yet. I think it's coming soon. I'd like to read it, but it's a weird thing because Major Nicholson really didn't have a huge impact on comics besides, to some degree, helping to create comics, because he had the idea of looking at newspaper strips and going, well, what if you folded them up and turned them into a magazine and sold them directly to the kids outside of the newspaper? And then he apparently wasn't a great businessman, was probably something of a con man. And so the whole idea basically got stolen from him by a couple of actual businessmen, Harry Donenfeld and Jack Leibowitz. And they're the ones who really made DC Comics. So they're always talking about, how the Major founded the company, but he's kind of a con man that sort of fell by the wayside. And it was the other two guys that really had that company rolling for years. And, it's the Great Depression. Any way you can make money is valuable to people. You got particularly Jack Leibowitz. He's the son of a socialist union boss and a guy who's like really trying to fight hard for the labor movement and everything. And I think Jack Leibowitz kind of watched the struggles that his father went through and how little that gained him. And he went the opposite way. He was just like a hardcore capitalist. And he's a guy who was always like really disturbed by comics and never really felt good about publishing comics. He felt, I think, a little bit like he was selling drugs to school children with these things. But it was hard times. He was making him money. And he had this business partner, Harry Donenfeld, who had mob ties. And it's one of the weird things with comics is it's always been comic plus something else that kept the comic industry going. In the case of Donenfeld, he supposedly was working with the mafia to bring in illegal booze from Canada with the shipments of comic books, because they were printed in Canada and they come across the border, and they're apparently supposed to be bringing booze with them as well. And I think other illegal substances and illegal trafficking took place under the cover of comics in that time period. But thanks to the war in particular, you had all these people who were going into service. They were flying all over the world. They didn't have access to a lot of entertainment, and so comic books were uniquely valuable as something that could be bought cheaply, bought in bulk. You could give it to soldiers. The soldiers could give it to kids in other parts of the world. It was the rare visual medium, at a time where the only really other visual medium that was out there was film, and you'd had to be in a certain place at a certain time to get that done, seen, where with comics you could take them anywhere and you got replay value. You could just read them over and over again. What was great about comics is people who were illiterate could just look at the pictures and it would still tell them a story, so you didn't even have to be a book reader. But basically, comic books, their peak was in the 1940s. They had a really nice time in the early part of the 50s, because when the servicemen came back and the kids kind of were starting to get swept up in movie serials and then later television, the dads were buying a lot of this stuff, and it was still sort of spank material, and they were also getting a lot of sex and violence there. They weren't getting elsewhere because the Hays Code prevented a lot of that stuff from being in the movies anymore, and TV was still just getting started, and they were much more squeaky clean. And so it was one place where a guy could kind of get his rocks off if he didn't want to read like girly magazines or like spicy detective fiction, that kind of thing. But the fact is, most of the comic book publishers were doing that too. Marvel definitely made money off girly magazines. Fawcett, who did Captain Marvel, they did the girly magazines. Really, DC was sort of an outlier in comics by not doing that sort of thing. They were always sort of like the somewhat squeaky clean, which is weird given their mob ties, but they were hardcore capitalists. They, there's a whole history of them fucking people over, right down to Superman getting bought for $138, something along those lines. And they had really shrewd businessmen who made sure that they stayed ahead of the game. They weren't number one one necessarily in the 50s. Dell, I think, was, because they had like the Disney license and such. But there was still money to be made in comics, and so they kept doing it as long as there was money there. But I think given just a few more years, somebody like Jack Leibowitz would have probably gotten out of comics. But then Frederick Wortham strikes, and you've got the book burnings, and you've got the comics as a scourge of our youth, and tying it up with the juvenile delinquency increase and everything else. And so it reminded me a lot of Mac. You were talking about Film and Fertitta, and I was also thinking about Ben Shapiro, where they're talking about, this cataclysm occurs, just sell your boat, just sell your house if the water rises, that sort of thing. And it's like, well, who the hell is going to be buying it under this climate? So going back to the Wortham hearings and all the stuff for the Congress looking into comics and juvenile delinquency in general, the time when you would have wanted to try to get out of comics was the exact time you couldn't, because nobody was buying into it. And so you basically had this zombie medium starting in the 1950s. And so really from that point onward, comic books should have died. And somehow it just kept not dying. One of the things that helped with that was the Superman TV show back in the 50s kept superheroes in the public eye, and superheroes started to regain popularity in the comics, in part because that was the one genre that nobody else could do right. Westerns got taken up by TV, cop shows got taken up by TV, romance got taken up by TV. There was so many different places you could get that type of material outside of comic, and comic books were so looked down upon that the one way that they managed to survive was by making the superhero books, the one thing that they were good at, that they weren't having competition for, and selling it hits. And DC did extremely well in the 50s by doing just that. But what happens is, again, those eyes get peeled away more and more over the years, particularly to television, but also to other things. And so DC continued that mindset where we're just going to keep selling to the kids, keep selling to the kids. And then you got sweaty little outfits like Marvel who stumble upon this formula where we can be a little bit more artsy, we get a little bit more counterculture, we can have like sort of dopey references and artsy references and do our like sort of Andy Warhol take on comic books. It catches on with the college kids, and you end up with a much older audience who view them as a counterculture icon. And so Marvel Comics gives comic books in general a second life and really steals the thunder away from DC over the course of a number of years. And DC, one thing that I never see talked about very much in general is how conservative DC Comics has pretty much always been. They never, for the most part, stooped to doing really hardcore horror stuff. They didn't do a lot of TNA stuff. They were always mindful of the kid stuff. Really, Leibowitz and Donenfeld had a lot to do with the creation of the Comics Code Authority, which they used to wipe out competition from places like EC that were willing to go to those places. They were always very, culturally conservative. And in the 60s and 70s, that was not the hip thing to do, and Marvel just completely started to destroy them. But then the 70s hit, and again, there's always this competition for people's eyes, and the newsstand just less and less wants anything to do with comic books. And so that's when comics in general get that third life, which is Phil Souling, a convention organizer, figures out that he could buy comics directly from, I believe he started at DC, but he might have cut a deal with DC and Marvel, where he basically get the comic permanently on a non-returnable basis at a steeper discount. He would make more profit off what he did sell, but he was going to be stuck with anything he didn't sell. And so that was basically the creation of the direct market. And so it's such a unique thing to think about periodicals. You always picture them being on a newsstand. You picture them having mass appeal. And so you have this industry that's getting increasingly niche, that has these little bumps every now and again that kind of helps keep them afloat, like Batmania. And because of fandom, comic books continue to exist because it takes a hardcore fandom to go to a guy like Souling, go to a comic shop or a specialty store specifically to buy a comic to keep the industry going. And you did have those little blips too, like with Conan, where the Sword and Sandal movies were killed back in the 60s because they just cost too much money. They had too many flops. Studio system was falling apart. And also, if you were a fan of somebody like Robert E. Howard, you were never going to get that real good sex and violence that you really wanted from your Conan material. But then Marvel managed to do that in the comics with their Conan adaptation. Going into the 70s, you didn't really have a lot of good, fun science fantasy. Again, it was too expensive. People were kind of in their heads in that point, so you had a lot of like ecologically aware science fiction and like really deep dive type stuff, really thoughtful type stuff, not a lot of fun material. And then Star Wars comes along, and once again, Marvel just reaps the benefits of having Star Wars expanded universe at a time when nothing else was out there. And then, going into the 80s, you have like G.I. Joe becomes this huge phenomenon. Transformers becomes this huge phenomenon. So there's all these lifelines that keep getting extended to the comic book industry going into the 80s. And it doesn't hurt, too, that you've got a guy like Jim Shooter running Marvel, who, this is a place where you've got all these fanboys who grew up on comics, who know the industry's dying, they know that sales are in the toilet, and so they're just kind of smoking a lot of pot and doing a lot of drugs and doing all kinds of crazy comic books. And there are people who appreciate that, but the 70s comic book market was going pretty well in the shitter. So Shooter comes in there, he cleans up the act, gets them in a corporate mentality, and he starts figuring out ways of, basically creating heat for comic books to get kids into them, to get the multimedia expansion, the synergy, and builds Marvel into this sort of corporate powerhouse, which is, obviously, something you couldn't do again today. But Jim Shooter also had this sense of integrity. The guy was, he basically was taught by Mort Weisinger, the guy who was making DC a commercial powerhouse with Superman in the 50s, and he applied that to Marvel. It worked for him, but also he wanted to be an artist. He still wanted to tell stories. He still saw himself as being part of the creative side. So he would get into these kind of tiffs with the suits. And then the suits were mad at him for getting in the way of them doing what they want to do, but he also had a lot of arbitrary decisions, and he also sided with the suits oftentimes. So creative hated him. So between these two warring factions, he gets booted out of Marvel, but Marvel continues to have that same corporate mentality, and he was just getting in the way of that. It just amps up further and further until you get Marvel being opened up to the stock market. They go public. They're worth a lot of money in the initial period. And then they have this rapacious appetite for, we have to buy more stuff so we can have more profit, so that we can have a great yield for our shareholders, or our share price stays the same or raises, which is exactly what you want to do in a stock market situation. Then you look at DC, because Marvel has been so commercially successful, they get all the top talent, but they also have the more, liberal mindset where, go off and throw stuff at the wall and have fun and see what works. They've got all the talent, they've got all the money, they've got all the eyes, and then DC continues to be this company that's just like stuck with the old-fashioned, old-timey creators and an old-timey mentality. What's interesting with DC is, as I said, they were struggling through the Wortham trial, and obviously somebody wanted to unload them as soon as they possibly could. And the opportunity finally presented itself in the 60s because of Batmania, because of comic books sort of being redeemed in the public eye through their successes and their multimedia representation. So this company that basically made parking lot and parking structure bought DC, and then that company got bought by Warner Brothers, and DC was just sort of like a value-added thing to this, company that Warner's bought. It's like, oh, we get a comic company too? Cool. Okay. So for the longest time, Warner doesn't really know what to do with DC, and so they're supported by that corporate structure. They're not, as long as they're not losing too much money, or they're at least kind of break even, make a little bit of profit, they kind of get left alone. Nobody knows how to make comics, or who make comics, or how they get made. So they get to coast on that corporate backing for the longest time, even though they were at best the number 2 publisher for just years and years. But Marvel, not only were they hungry, and they too got sold. They got sold off in the early 70s, as I recall, and then they went from buyer after buyer, and what they were constantly doing year after year was they'd set up for the next buyer. So they'd find some way to like inflate the value of the company, and then they'd sell it off, and the next guy would have to do that all over again. And then finally you end up at the point where they're public, and so you've actually got investors you've got to answer to. And so they just kept going and going and going with buying Panini and buying Toy Biz and just buying Malibu, buying out their competition, absorbing their resources. They're just like the Borg for a long time there. So the ultimate manifestation of that was when they decided that he wanted to cut out the distributors and just distribute for themselves. They were going to buy out this company called Heroes World that had done mail order. You may remember back in the 70s and 80s, there used to be ads that were drawn by Joe Kubert's school showing like representations of toys and merch, and the earliest incarnations of that being available to the direct market. And so these Heroes World were pioneers in this. And so Marvel buys Heroes World with the intent of having them be their exclusive distributor, and that creates the distribution wars of like 1994 or so, where ultimately DC Comics not only becomes exclusively distributed by Diamond Distribution, but also they have the option of buying Diamond at some point if they are so inclined. Now, because DC aligns with Diamond, almost everybody else falls in line with DC because they can't fall in line with Heroes World because Marvel isn't interested in distributing anybody else's books but their own. And so that became the situation for about 30 years, 25, 30 years. All the other distributors went out of business. Everybody was at Diamond. Steve Geppi essentially had a monopoly. And, at the end of the day, if DC wanted them, they could always buy them up. So everybody kind of knew what the situation was. It was the devil you knew. We all went to the same place. And eventually Heroes World collapsed because Heroes World was never designed to distribute periodicals around the world. They just weren't built for it. They didn't have the manpower for it. They didn't have the full resources. And then, of course, Marvel began to go into bankruptcy. They all of their stock portfolio started to crash. Their value on the stock market, went bottoms up. They couldn't maintain what they had built. It just all collapsed underneath them. And Marvel eventually came back to Diamond, and they everybody was just in that one house. Marvel, through their manipulations and their constant need to make more and more money, wiped out the comic book industry. And I get tired of them talking about, well, it was Image, and it was this and it was that. Really, while the industry was collapsing before Heroes World, and Heroes World was probably a way for them to try to just make more money off the comic books with what was left of the industry, it was still the fact that you had all those distributors fall apart, you had all those conflicts and all those exclusive deals. It just messed up everything for everyone, essentially. And so that was sort of like the Marvel implosion, too, because they struggled through bankruptcy for the rest of the 90s into the 2000s. That's when they had to pawn some of their big characters to try to get money to eventually create what became Marvel Studios. But it was just a long process. And a lot of people were focused on Marvel and talk about this rags to riches story with Marvel because of them getting bought by Disney and then becoming this gigantic media powerhouse. But what sometimes gets lost in the shuffle is that at the same time, DC was getting new ownership. Time Warner merged with AOL back when that was the thing to do, because the internet was going to be the new horizon, and AOL was at the vanguard of that. And guys may remember when AOL bought Time Warner, they did everything they could to divest themselves of anything physical. And one of the big casualties of that were the WB stores, which were awesome. I think we all love the WB stores. And Warner Brothers, great company to work for. I remember when I had my first shop, there was a guy that I palled around with and played Star Wars collectible card game with and stuff. And he was a Disney guy and I was a Warner Brothers guy. So he wanted to one day grow up and become a Disney animator, and he would tell me about how awesome Disney was. And Disney had a somewhat bad reputation because up and through the 90s, they were kind of like a sweatshop. If you were a Disney executive, it'd be great to work there. But if you worked there in other capacities, the benefits weren't so great. You were kind of treated as disposable. Where Warner Brothers, this great big media titan, they had the Turner properties, and they had all their movies, and they had Looney Tunes, and they had a great reputation, and they did some of the best movies of all time. So these would seem like a great place to work for. And then you've got the WB stores that represent DC in a way that you'd never got to see before, with all these cool collectibles like Alex Ross painted plates and stuff like that. And they just closed it all up. AOL was like, we don't need that anymore. And we're all like, AOL are idiots. They're going to ruin Time Warner. They don't know what they're doing. But you think about it, the WB stores closed in the early 2000s, and then within a decade of that, who the fuck goes to malls anymore? Amazon's already on the rise at this point. I think that maybe AOL was on to something by divesting themselves of all these physical locations, because I think they maybe saw the future, and there wasn't a future in being the actual physical representation of their own sales. They having to be the people who actually sell directly to the public, create a middleman and let them deal with the headache. So then we get to modern time. And one thing that I've been watching in recent years is what was going on at Diamond. In particular, Steve Geppi had sort of semi-retired, and they got another guy to run Diamond. And then all of a sudden, Geppi formed this thing, I think it was called Geppi Family Entertainment. And like different aspects of the company sort of got moved around and such. And then that president guy got fired, and then Geppi came back again. And there were all these weird moves that made you wonder if something was going on, with Diamond. And, back in the 90s, we talked about how poor the sales were because, in the 70s, Marvel would be canceling books that didn't sell above 100,000 copies. In the early 90s, you're talking about books that were selling millions of copies, and there's an expectation you need to post 200, 500, 1,000 copies, 100,000 copies a month to really stay in the game, right? So by the time you get to the late 90s, early 2000s, you're looking at print runs more like, 40,000 for a mid-range book, 70 to 100,000 for one of the more successful ones, but certainly a lot of books were still selling 150,000 copies, things like that. Well, now, 20 years later, a blockbuster comic book with multiple covers and all these incentives, you're lucky if you crack 200,000. Mostly 150,000 is like an absolute blockbuster in comics these days. Your average books, like mid-range, are selling at or below around 20,000 copies, okay? Why do you still have a comic book industry when you've got those kind of small numbers, The price keeps going up and up. The demographics that actually continue to buy physical comics keep getting older and older. And the only reason why the comic book industry has survived, really the 90s even, was because of the fans. The 70s even was because of the fans. Because the people who work in this industry and support this industry love the medium of comics. They love working in the industry. They love being creative people. You look at somebody like Steve Geppi, another person who I've heard at times maybe had some mafia ties, but, let's not get ourselves in any trouble there. He's a guy who definitely can kind of throw his weight around, he could muscle people and the like. And you could think that, he's only in this for the money. But if you ever went to the Geppi Museum in Baltimore, I was lucky enough, we were on a road trip and stumbled upon it. I didn't even mean to go there. Basically, I think I saw something while we were trying to navigate where I was like, oh wait, isn't the Geppi Museum around here? And we pull in and there's like maybe 45 minutes before the place is going to close. And so me and Paquita, my girlfriend, we just like try to barrel through this museum as quickly as we possibly can. And it was magnificent. So many cool pop culture items displayed so attractively, multiple stories. It was a real museum. It was a legit museum. A person doesn't create a thing like that unless he absolutely loves it. And then in recent years, with pretty much no warning, with like maybe a few weeks warning, the whole thing closed down and no more Geppi Museum. Okay. That's definitely a major warning sign. All these movements, all these contractions. So for a while there, I was already looking at Diamond and wondering what was going on there. Then during the COVID crisis, DC says, okay, well, we're looking at no longer having our exclusive arrangement. And everybody went, whoa, because you're talking about decades of this being the norm, Why wouldn't DC want to have an exclusive arrangement with Diamond anymore? And at the time, I thought there was something weird going on with Diamond, and I was afraid that it was going to be Diamond that collapses. But instead what happens is DC, after a certain moratorium period ends, DC announces they're going to start having all their comics distributed outside Diamond distribution by companies that are like shell companies for Midtown Comics and Discount Comic Book Service, okay? These are companies that existed to buy comics from Diamond and then send them to individuals who bought those comic books, at a substantial discount. So they already were cutting into the money that could be made by comic shop. So so now all of a sudden they're going to be the exclusive distributors of DC Comics. And it's impossible to hear that as a person, as a veteran of the distributor wars, and not think back Heroes World. And we're in a so much worse place than Marvel and Heroes World were back in the day. And at least Heroes World weren't really direct competition with comic shops, especially because comic shops were healthier at that time period. You're literally taking a competitor for brick and mortar comic shops and saying you're now going to be the only place you can get DC Comics from. And having had personal experience with those mail order outfits, they don't know how to pack books well. It's not rocket science, but they don't do it well. And you can't resell fucked up comic book at comic book shop. And that's going to cost somebody some money. And these are guys, they're small operations, and they're doing this in the midst of a pandemic. So you know they don't have access to staff, most probably. They certainly don't have access to trained staff, or the resources necessary to train staff. So it's all being done in the midst of the worst circumstance you could possibly be making these sort of major moves. And the rationale is pretty obvious in retrospect. AT&T bought Warner Brothers. They have HBO. They're trying to get into all this streaming. Just like what happened at AOL, AT&T doesn't want physical media. Nobody really wants physical media these days. As you know, everything's being streamed nowadays. And so, like, Disney is phasing out their 4K Blu-rays they've bought the Fox library, but they're not keeping those titles available in physical media. And, of course, everybody wants to move to streaming, and one of the easiest ways to get people to get subscribe to your streaming options is to not give them any alternatives. If you have physical media out there, you have an alternative to streaming. You don't have to subscribe to that particular service. You can just buy the movie you want elsewhere. So you have to limit the accessibility of that. If that's where your head's at, and you've got this tiny little comic company that has extremely valuable IP, but they're continuing to produce these things that nobody wants in tiny little quantities, and you've got executives that have been in this company 35, almost 40 years making buku bucks, well, guess what? If you're trying to make your company more profitable, especially in the midst of a pandemic where everybody's shares were going down, and you have a relatively unsuccessful launch of your big streaming platform, HBO Max, the easiest thing to do to start out with is just cut as many fat salaries as possible, make everything as cheap as possible to produce and make as great of a return. So why would you print comic books when you could just have digital media that's, where you have no middleman? And because there's still a market for the comics and, there may be various contracts in the way, maximize your profits by doing this mail order scheme that they've got going on. Cut Diamond out, but probably inevitably cut physical print media out. And so that's basically where we're at.
Whoa. Welcome to Frank's TED Talk.
Okay, so that was pretty interesting with what was it called? What was Marvel's distributor called?
Heroes World. You don't remember Heroes World?
Yeah, it sounds familiar.
Is that the one that was at the end of the books where you could pick the comics you want and mail to you?
Less of that. Joe Kubert and his students used to actually draw belts. You could buy Spider-Man belt or toys, T-shirts. They didn't have good quality photographs that could print well on newsprint.
I can't remember that
drawings
now.
Of it. Yeah, and so that's where Heroes World got their start. Now, by the time Marvel bought them, they were doing more mail order of comics and stuff, but they weren't even one of the big ones in that arena. They were much bigger. American Entertainment, we talked about on Spawnometer, where Image Comic partnered with American Entertainment to get their Image Zero out to people. You don't want to buy somebody like that was, really getting a lot of books out there. Heroes World was almost like an afterthought. They were so small. They were just this old company. I guess they got them relatively cheap, and they thought they were going to be able to distribute with this company that just was not built for it.
Interesting. But at least they bought something with some architecture where, correct me if I'm wrong, but what DC is doing is from scratch, right?
Well, see, that's just it, is DC doesn't own these people. They didn't buy their own Heroes World. They went to a couple of mail order outfits and said, okay, you distribute our comic books now.
Oh, okay. Okay, gotcha.
So these are guys who have probably a warehouse each and a small staff, and they're going to now be responsible for getting physical DC comic books around the world, but especially, I think they just do North American distribution, but still, they're a warehouse operation, they're not even remotely where Heroes World was.
Yeah, but at the same time, times be different, right? So, maybe the costs that they were incurring with Diamond just didn't make sense with how few comic books are sold nowadays. You know what I mean? I'm sure the costs were probably the same, except they're doing a fifth of the number of sales they used to. And then, God, who knows what the cost of shipping costs and raw materials papers and inks and all that stuff. I can't imagine any of that stuff's getting cheaper, right?
No. Well, and although I don't think there's much demand for paper as there used to be, especially for print media. But one issue I have too with these mail order outfits is besides not being able to pack very well, they also cost a lot of money. They charge a lot of money to ship shit. And I'm wondering how that's going to work when every comic book company, every brick and mortar comic shop probably has to pay inflated shipping prices, that's going to eat into their profit. It's just, there's nothing about that works very well. And then also you look at, apparently, AT&T has this renegade investor who's just been pushing for profitability, and they've been looking for ways to make that happen. You got guys like Dan Didio who this guy's been running the company for like 15 years. He gets fired, out of the blue. Okay. You got all these sex scandals in recent months. With Me Too, you got Cameron Stewart, Warren Ellis, Jason Latour, Eric Esquivel, the Comic Book League of Defense Fund. Warren Ellis, basically, he was like this massive adulterer where he would just like having dozens and dozens of women, manipulating them. So he'd have basically somebody to fuck in every town. And they finally started talking to each other and realized he was just like constantly lying to them and doing all kinds of stuff. So it's it's not sexual assault, but because of the nature of consent,
he's a douchebag. That way,
it gets to he was a serial womanizer, and again, he wasn't married to any of these women or anything else, but he was in relationships with a number of these women, and basically everybody was cheating on everybody.
It's more of a moral judgment on that.
No, for sure. I don't think he's been accused of doing anything illegal.
Yeah, I mean that's more of a moral judgment. If you're going to call him that, that's fine. But
I think some of the
break the law.
I think some of the women were pretty young though.
But yeah, it was something like with him. I think
he was like grooming these women and shit. Like it's pretty fucked up what he was doing. But no, it was definitely not against the law. It's the same way with like Chris D'Elia, that comic right now. It's like everybody keeps trying to say like, well, he didn't do anything wrong. It's like, yeah, but he was like, he would DM a chick and she'd be like, I'm 16, and then literally like 2 years to the day later, like he set a fucking calendar reminder.
Shit.
It would go off and they would show the next reply was, hey, what are you doing now? And it's like, whoa, like that's not illegal, but
it's creepy.
That's some creepy.
It's morally comprehensive.
It's some great. Well, then that's like, well, what did we not hear about? You know what I mean? Yeah. So
I also heard he had something of a don't ask, don't tell policy when it came to age. So there might have been some underage things going on there too.
Yeah. But it's like it's somebody as soon as like these women he would make them feel like they're like in love, and then as soon as one of them would bring up something negative, he'd be like, see ya, and just completely cut ties with them. Like he's like ruining these like young girls' lives and shit. It was kind of fun. Whatever. It's nobody's coming to arrest him, but professionally it's bad for you.
Yes. But the really bad one was Eddie Berganza, who was the Superman group editor for just years and years. And this guy was just a serial sexual harasser to the point where women weren't allowed to work in the Superman group. They didn't, for the most part, have women writers, creative, sub-editors, assistants, anything. The DC allowed this guy to continue to be in a position of power that literally they had to exclude women from his sphere, the Superman books, because he was so bad. There's a lot of like liability there that they should have dealt with a lot sooner. And that's one good reason for Dan Didio to not be there anymore. And I was watching an interview with him where somebody asked him and he was just like, nope, not answering that one. He's just like, sorry, that's one question I'm not going to get into. So he didn't, I just spoke more about that than he was willing to. So yeah, I'm sure that helped a lot.
Okay. So let's go to the group that was laid off here this last week. I don't think I recognize any of these folks except for Big Bob Harris, who it's like and this is what I think is interesting about Bob Harris is that like I don't want to speak for a retailer since I only like was an employee in a comic book shop. So maybe Diabolu Frank, you can speak to this. But like to me, like Bob Harris and Tom DeFalco were like the face of all of the comic book industry's troubles. Like it's like we had to pin it on somebody, and it always just seemed like it was Tom DeFalco or Bob Harris. Like they were the ones who took all the blame from me in the 90s for the I don't know fucking catchy phrase I can, but where it's everything had to be collectibles. We got to have 50 different variant covers. You know what I mean? Blah 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 blah.
Were they involved in that the one Marvel stunt that I've always hated was the Nuff Said, where all the books are silent?
No, but that's not really. I'm talking about the fucking plasma color, the fucking Tyvek covers and 18 different
the laser cut covers and
die cuts and embossed and holographic. That's the kind of shit I'm talking about. Where
like I can think of that one Spider-Man where there was like fucking 7 different holograms of different colors.
Well, it's all of them. It's like why X-Men #1 was the highest selling comic book of all time. It's because you had to buy every single piece of
make that poster,
the poster or the comic book card or the sealed bags with the card inside of it. So you'd have to buy one to keep sealed, and you got to buy another one so you can actually open it.
I do still have my Death of Superman, so
all that kind of shit. I was like, as somebody who read the comic books in the 90s, it was always Bob Harris and fucking Tom DeFalco. Those are the guys I always blamed for this shit. And then I couldn't believe it when I was hearing about the New 52 stuff, and I heard Bob Harris's name pop up, and I'm like, that motherfucker is over at DC now. Or correct me if I'm wrong, maybe he wasn't there during the New 52.
He was.
Was he? Okay.
I
started hearing about, and Jim Lee was there too, and I'm like, well, fucking Jim Lee was there in the 90s. Didn't he know Bob Harris is as bad? But then, so Bob Harris gets laid off, and I'm going through Instagram, and I see Rob Liefeld just has this outpouring of support for Bob Harris and what a great friend he was and how great he was for the industry. And that's when I realized, I was like, holy shit, like I really have a completely different perspective than people in the industry. Because I'm like, okay, I guess that's why he stuck around. All these guys loved him because he was the one who came up with the idea or was part of the idea to put the trading cards inserted in the X-Force issue to sell 1 billion fucking copies. So of course Rob Liefeld loves him, and he was there like, yeah, that'd be a great idea. Let's take your big poster, Jim Lee, and let's fucking cut it up, and we're gonna have to make everybody's got to buy 6 fucking issues of X-Men #1, plus the one with the gatefold, plus the ones they're gonna actually just read to make it sell whatever it was, 2 million copies of X-Men #1. So it was just funny when I was reading that. I was like, what the hell is Rob talking about? Like, to me, I was like, finally somebody, Bob Harris got right. And then it was just weird to see it from somebody inside the industry's perspective, where they're like, oh, we love Bob was great, and it was just like, oh well, as somebody who collected comic books, we fucking hated that guy, because yeah, he was making your comics sell 5 times as many as it should, but on my end it was extremely annoying, and now I gotta dig through dollar bins, and it's just all of this bullshit because everything was produced in quintuplets, and it got that collector card, the collector cardification of comic books that drove that spectator bubble. Then it fucking burst, and nobody gave a shit about stories anymore. It was all about shitty art.
One issue, or
well, and then that
one hologram.
Then that developed eventually into the reboot, which kind of was like a different take on it. But it was just interesting. I see Bob Harris's name pop up there, and I'm like, somebody finally got that motherfucker. Like, I mean, I hate the guy lost. Look, I don't want anybody to lose their fucking job, especially now in a pandemic. But it was just crazy to me that he's a cockroach. That's a fun guy. Like, literally, he should be up on a wall. Like, hey, how are we trying to run our comic book company right now? Don't do what, like, he should be on the wall with some of these other offenders from the 90s. Be like, these are the motherfuckers that kind of oversaw the downfall of this industry. Let's not get them back in here. And it's just funny to see some of their names still out there working. It's crazy. Anyway, some of these other guys I don't know. There's like,
well, before you move
Hank
past,
Cannell, Bobby Chase. I think I've heard of
hold on. Let's talk about Bob Harris just a little bit more. So the thing you got to remember about Bob Harris is he was the guy who was like, Chris Claremont's been doing X-Men 16 years. I'm going to better deal this guy. But the way he better dealed them, and the way he better dealed Louise Simonson on New Mutants, is like, hey, this Rob Liefeld kid, he looks like he could be somebody. I'm going to get him on New Mutants, and then I'm going to eventually let him write the book and redesign the book and turn it into a multi-million selling. So obviously Rob Liefeld's going to appreciate that. Jim Lee, he gets control of the X-Men when Chris Claremont's get pushed out, and then he gets to have the greatest selling comic book of all time. That's not going to hurt his feelings. Bob Harris is probably the guy, if I remember correctly, who hired Mark Silvestri and put him on X-Men, where before that he'd been doing like fucking Conan. So obviously Mark Silvestri's going to have some love for Bob Harris. He rehired those guys after Image happened to do Heroes Reborn, which, if you think about it, the New 52 is just Heroes Reborn writ large, and so it gives him an opportunity to work on these characters one more time in a big way and sell a lot of comic books. Rob Liefeld loves to tell everybody that the best-selling Captain America comic book of all time was drawn by him. So Bob Harris had successes, but also obviously some failings. For instance, a lot of the fans were not happy with things like Heroes Reborn, and that's why after he brought in, keep in mind, he's the one who brought in Joe Quesada and Jimmy Palmiotti under the Marvel Knights header to do their little subline, which is sort of like a softer version of what was being done with Heroes Reborn, and they did so well with that the people who were running Marvel decided that they preferred Joe Quesada to run the company over him. But he's the one who gave them the green light in the first place. So there's pros and cons with Bob Harris. There's definitely reasons to be mad at him, but there's also reasons to value him creatively. But at the same time, it's hard not to think that New 52 had a lot to do with him, and a lot of people point to New 52 as a sort of a breaking point for DC. It sold great, though. You can't forget the first year or so of New 52 was a huge success for DC. It really shot up the sales. It's just that the novelty wore off, and then they came down to a lower point than they were at before all the hubbub.
Which is that's what these things do. That's what these crossovers do. That's what these the reboots do. That's what the 15 different prismatic covers do. You just start living off these the big crossovers. You're just trying to live off these crossovers, and people fucking hate this shit. Like, that's the stuff people get frustrated with, and they just go, you know what? You're gonna start it over at 1. That's as much a jumping off point for me as it is a starting point for someone else. And I think every time you did that, you lost some more people, and you lost some more people, and you lost some more people to where it's at now, where there's just fucking nobody. Now, obviously, that's oversimplification of it. We've got there's movies and video games and fucking TikTok and Flim Flam and whatever the kids are looking at nowadays. All this stuff is also distracting and detracting from comic books as well. But I think you did have a base, and I think every time you do one of those events, you chipped your base away.
Well, and also a lot of it goes back to things like the Mutant Massacre. The Mutant Massacre was a story that Claremont wanted to tell over a few of the X books, and he was working with some of the other X writers, and they kind of wanted to get involved too. And it was just a fun little blip that sold extremely well and took books like Power Pack that weren't doing great and shot their sales through the roof. And so it was decided, well, we need to do this every year to pump up these sales. And it worked for a while because they had stories tell that were expansive enough to support that. But an early breaking point for that was Inferno, where Claremont just had a few, him and the X Factor people and the New Mutants people were all working together to resolve a bunch of storylines that had been going on for a long time. And they figured they'd resolve it all at once, this one big thing. And before he knew it, every Marvel comic book being produced tied into Inferno, because because it was a tide that rose all the ship. But that was also at a time where comic books cost like $1.25, and where you still had like newspaper distribution, and you still had like newsprint distribution, you had newsstand distribution, you had a voracious fan base, you had a young fan base. That trick doesn't work when your fan base is 40 and your comics cost $4 each. And frankly, a lot of times the stories suck. And I hate these. I don't want to be in line with these comic gators guys who's like, well, it's the quality. The books weren't very good. That's why we weren't selling really well. Well, I mean, sometimes that's true, but there are plenty of great books that never sell worth a shit either. It's not about the story quality. It's about recognizing the limits of your audience, the limits of their bank accounts, the limits of your reach and your influence and your draw. You know, just because you throw an event doesn't mean everybody's going to come. And they kept throwing these events under the assumption that they were going to boost sales, and it just kept it was an anchor. It was actually dragging comics as an industry down lower and lower. But you mentioned the same thing, though. It's like they're looking at it from month to month. You're not looking at the long term. They're not looking at the long term health, because you shouldn't look at the long term health, because this is an industry that should have been dead 40, 50 years ago. And it's this zombie industry that keeps being, take Bob Harris, for instance, right? This guy has devoted his life to comics. However you feel about this guy, he's been an editor or editor-in-chief at a big company since around like 85 or 86, something like that, okay? Think about how many people have been born and died in that time period, okay? So if he's got a pretty decent bank account, if he's collecting some money because he's had loyalty to this company, he's been with them for a number of years, and he had long-term loyalty to Marvel, and he was rewarded for that as well, he's got to be at retirement age at this point. He's got to be in his 60s by now, right? Why would you pull a trigger on your career? As long as you can keep it going for a few more months, every month you make comic book industry continue to survive, you won. That was one of the big things with Dan Didio, is he got a lot of people who hated on him. I hated his creative vision, and he himself would say that he was doing a lot of stuff that he did not because it's what he wanted to do, but he could see that they generated sales. And part of what drove Dan Didio was that he was trying to keep as many of these people employed for as long as possible in an industry that they love. It doesn't mean that you're going to serve the long-term health of the industry, but at the same time, just rationally, why do comics even still exist? And how much longer could you get away with producing comic books in a world that had very much moved past them decades ago?
Yeah, and I just want to say, when I shit on those are the things that I just really, I think unanimously people were like, oh, that's what sucked about 90s. That's when 90s comic books, that's when the comic industry went to shit. But I mean, I hate whenever you criticize something without an alternative. Like, you know what I mean? Like, well, okay, well, what else were they supposed to do? And you know what? Maybe I don't know the answer to that, right? Like, I don't know. I don't know what the answer is to it. I just can tell you, at the time in the industry, we all hated this shit, and you would hate seeing people come in and they're like, I gotta buy them all. I gotta buy all 5, and I'm gonna vacuum seal them, and we're never gonna see them because I know one day I'm gonna sell these and make millions of dollars. Because did you see what Action Comics just came up with? Something, you know what I mean? Like you know what I mean? Like, it's just I don't know what
one collector at Frank's shop that used to do that.
Yeah,
all the time.
Look,
he would go to the box and look for that one issue that wasn't too creased.
He needed the pristine, right. And I correct me if I'm wrong, Frank, but that's what he would do. The dude bought just so much comic books, and he was the only one, maybe not on quite the scale that this guy did, but he was like, this is like my kids' college education. Like, they're going to be able to sell these comic books and go to college, or I'm going to be able to sell these comic books and retire. And it's just like, look, I think the industry, I think you got to have you got to take some responsibility for this shit too. Like, some of this stuff might have actually been worth money if you weren't producing it in just the absurd scales that you were. But again, I don't know what the answer was, but I think we can all say that was probably not the healthiest thing to do, right? It was not the healthiest thing to do for the long term of the industry. But like you said, it kind of keeps going on, and it's because of movies now. Well, you know what? For the longest time, if you wanted to get this fantastical, like you said, there was no competition. Like, there's no competition. You couldn't do Superman and Spider-Man and Hulk. You would do these hokey versions on TV. As much as they tried, right? Like, it was never nearly as good as picking up a comic book and flipping through it, right? Like, they just couldn't do it. And now technology is caught up even with the comic books, and to where it's honestly, it's better. It's almost better to watch it. With the CGI's gotten so good, and the level of talent they're able to attract, and the amount of money they're able to spend on these movies, it's just as good, if not better, than what you can see drawn in a comic book. And although it costs more to produce a movie, I only spend 2 hours with it, 3 hours with it, and the studio makes billions of dollars off of it. It's just like infinitely more profitable too. But that is like that's what's kind of kept it now going a little bit longer, because I think even these big studios don't really know, like, is it worth keeping these little industries alive, and the chance that something new could come out, like The Walking Dead, for example. Like, maybe something hasn't been thought of yet, and maybe if we just keep the comic books going a little bit more, we'll get another one of those ideas, and that will completely.
They're just mining. They're mining property.
Right. But did they continue to mine existing properties, or do they want to keep generating new properties, or do they think having the comic books there will continue to get people moving? Like, you're keeping it in the zeitgeist. You know what I mean? Like, if they stop making comic books altogether, there's a chance you might actually kind of forget about some of these characters. But the fact that even though they're being bought in very small quantities, the fact that they're kind of still out there keeps it in the public's mind that it justifies its existence from a large corporate owner. You know what I mean?
I see them more gearing the product or the characters toward younger audiences, like through games, toys, trying to hook them when they're young. Not so much comics. Like, you're right. I see a lot of, like, Marvel T-shirts and video games. Something that's digital, replayable. The toys are still pretty popular. The figures.
But that's the thing. So what's a better chance? You tell the guys at Lego, hey, just come up with some new shit and see how popular it is, or do you say we're going to keep our comic book division going and keep the minds there, sort of keep churning stories and ideas with those characters, and then we will license Avengers to Lego, and you can make a Lego game, make a Lego movie, you can make a Lego playset. Are they comfortable enough to say, you know what, we're not making any more comic books, just keep churning the stuff that's there now, or come up with your own new stuff, Lego? Like I said, even like Lego probably wants comic books to keep going. You know what I mean? Because they're like, look, these guys just do some good shit. They do good shit. They've been doing this forever.
A few years ago, they did a story called Secret Empire. And in that story, they tried to reveal that Captain America had always been compromised by Hydra, that he was basically always a secret Nazi. And it just happens that they decided to tell that story in like 2017 at a time where the political climate was not receptive to that at all. And just huge amounts of bad press over this comic book. And because it's a comic book, you've got months of lead-in time of them working on it and trying to see this thing to its conclusion. And so you had this months of bad press over that. That's when comic books become a liability. They recently started the DC Black Label, where they were going to do more like dark, grimdark stuff for mature audiences with their more mainstream stuff. And they have Batman running around with his cock out. People were not amused by that. They got press, but no, people were very unhappy that was the kind of press that they were getting.
I like the Wonder Woman stuff.
What do you mean? Oh, the Dead Earth stuff?
Yeah.
Yeah. I'm not saying there was good stuff, but I'm saying that, like, okay, another example is that, like, a lot of comic book shop owners are very conservative about social stuff. A lot of them are either politically conservative or they just don't want the hassle of a parent walking up to them, waving a comic book in their face and screaming at them, which is reasonable.
That's true.
Okay. So in the animation of Batman the Animated Series, going back to the 90s, there's always the inference that Harley Quinn and Poison Ivy had a relationship, that wasn't just buddies. And you watch the Harley Quinn cartoon that's on, what is it, on DC Universe?
Yeah.
Yeah. They've been very overt with them being in a romantic relationship there. But in the comic books, because of whatever reasons, maybe there was an in-house problem with it or because of a fear of pushback, but they kept walking further and further back away from them being in a relationship. They wanted them to just be friends. They kept arguing that they wanted Poison Ivy to go back being more of a mainstream villainous rather than being a duo with Harley Quinn. There was comic books that were redrawn to where they went from kissing on the lips to like a kiss on the forehead and stuff. And, social media got really upset about what they called straight washing of this couple, right? At a time where a gay representation is very important, and a lot of progress has been made. It was seen as being regressive. And you've got these characters in other media being allowed to be represented as bisexual or lesbian, but the comic books are being backward and trying to act like they're straight when everybody knows that they're not. So it's a situation where, yeah, you've got the comic books as a cheap R&D, but you've also got an increasingly aging and kind of out of step audience. It's funny because you've got all these comic skaters coming out going, yeah, DC, you fools, you should have listened to us and you should have done what we told you to do. And it's like, guys, you were talking about Marvel all this time. Marvel are the social justice warriors. DC was the closest thing you had to an ally. They were doing shit like straight washing Harley and they're the ones who got gutted. So this doesn't prove anything at all except that you as an audience are not who is being targeted anymore. There's all these old guys who don't recognize the world has moved past them and they're not the audience anymore. They may be the audience in the comic book shop, but there aren't any comic book shops anymore, and they're doing this R&D through animation, which has gotten cheaper to do in recent years, a lot more computer-rated stuff. Why wouldn't you field test it in animation? Why wouldn't you field test it on like shorts that are on YouTube? Why wouldn't you field test it on like a graphic novel where you have more quality control, where you can debate what you want to have, rather than this periodicals that come out month after month where they let people kind of do whatever the hell they want to sometimes. Not anything they want to, but because you've got this engine where we got to have a comic book come out this month at this time period, as much as the schedules have slipped over the years, you're going to get away with stuff and you're going to do stuff that you wouldn't do otherwise because of that monthly schedule, that monthly grind. Or in this case, DC started doing bi-monthly because it was worth it to them to have two Batman comic books out as opposed to one Young Justice comic book, which is why Young Justice got canceled. Batgirl got canceled. Batman and the Outsiders got canceled. Hawkman, Hellblazer, Justice League Odyssey, Suicide Squad, Teen Titans. They're talking about Aquaman maybe getting canceled because they could have 2 Batman comic books in that same time slot. But Batman is your fucking jewel, your gem, the one that brings all the kids to the yard, the one thing that Marvel, you can wave in Marvel's face and say, but you haven't got Batman. And you're going to let him whip out his Batwing, and get all that bad press.
Wasn't Harley Quinn created kind of because everyone thought that Joker was gay for Batman?
I've never heard that in one of the official
that
lines.
Morrison wrote him that way. Yeah. In Arkham Asylum, that he wrote him that way.
Yeah, very possible, but I've never heard that as being like, I don't remember ever hearing anybody from DC say that.
Oh, no,
they
didn't want me to create it, but I remember reading Morrison stuff and people were like, oh yeah, the Joker's gay. And I'm like, really? And they're like, yeah, read the book. And that's why he has a hard-on for Batman so much.
Well,
then all of a sudden,
also Frank Miller wrote him gay in Dark Knight Returns too.
And she's like, don't you want to ride your Harley? Then Harley goes gay, and now they create some new character called Punchline, apparently. That's like Joker's new girlfriend, but she's not a girlfriend. She's his partner. So I haven't read a Batman book, the Court of Owls stuff, and then just kind of walked away because it just got fucking weird. Oh, sorry, I didn't mean to cut in there.
No, it's fine. But I was just pointing out that Frank Miller wrote him as gay in Dark Knight Returns. Well,
did he?
Did you not get that?
I'm trying to, dude. I haven't read that book in so fucking long. I have to reread it. But I remember someone telling me about the Morrison stuff, like, oh yeah, the way it's written, and if you read his dialogue, and I was like, so I've been meaning to go back and reread Arkham Asylum. I haven't read that in 10 years almost.
I never was big on Arkham Asylum, but I try to read Dark Knight Returns, once a decade or so at least.
I haven't read that in a while, so I'm gonna have to go back.
Okay. Okay. Let me get us back on track here so we can kind of wrap this up.
Well,
okay, so
you were talking about the people you didn't know. Just to tell you who some of these people were. Hank Cannells was the co-creator of Youngblood, even though he never gets credited for it, and he's been working at DC since like the mid '90s. You got Bobby Chase, who was a great editor at Marvel Comics. She was the editor that was with Peter David for most of his run on the Incredible Hulk, and brought in all that murderer's row of comic book artists. She's been a VP at DC for at least since the New 52 era or a little bit before then. Brian Cunningham goes back to the early days of Wizard Magazine. You've got Jonah Weiland, the guy who ran Comic Book Resources and sold it a few years ago. He was working at DC and he got fired. Andy Corey, who I believe was at Comics Alliance. Mark Doyle. But I mean, just to show how deep the cuts were, Eddie Choi was the executive assistant to Jim Lee, his direct assistant, the guy, he got cut. So when Jim Lee can't even keep his assistant, shit's really kind of hitting the fan. And most of it goes back to that guy, this one rogue investor that's like insisting on them making money even in the midst of this pandemic. And people talk about this being like it's targeting DC. DC definitely took a lot of hits, but Warner Brothers across the board took hits too. Tons of old school VPs. You had a guy who had been there for like 37 years who got canned. You got their chief financial officer got canned. You got their worldwide television distribution president. You had guys who were running TBS, TNT, True TV. They all got canned. We're thinking about it a lot because DC took the brunt of it, but across the board, Warner Brothers was getting things whacked left and right. And just a few months ago, they were talking about selling off Warner Brothers Interactive, their video game company, and they were going to try to get about $4 billion off of that because they went into debt buying Warner Brothers, and so they're trying to recoup that. And things haven't been going according to plan. But they realized that most of what was valuable about Warner Brothers Interactive was the IP stream, that they have access to all these Warner Brothers properties. So if you try to sell the company, you've got some great coders and stuff. You've got some great studios, but without the IP, where do you get the value for that? You're basically screwing yourself. And then the HBO Max launch was also just a huge hit for them. They're still not on Amazon. They're still not on Roku. You guys don't fucking have the shit, why the fuck are we months into the HBO Max's launch? And by the way, it's a great channel. You don't get a ton of new stuff because it's basically the Warner catalog and stuff, but it's still a really good channel with a good interface. But the main people who watch streaming are watching it on Amazon and Roku, and they still haven't fucking gotten on there. And so they've only got a few million subscribers. This is not the way this shit was supposed to go.
Yeah, I think even John Oliver's made jokes like HBO Max. Nobody knows what it is. Like we don't understand what is. I got HBO Go and I've got HBO. So what is HBO Max and what do I pay separately or do I get nobody has a clue what the hell this thing is?
Yeah, I mean one of the big selling point is a bunch of movies that are going to go to other streamers soon. Everybody's been joking about how we've got all the Harry Potter movies until they go to Peacock in a few months. Shit like that. And that's part of why the DC Universe app isn't dead. They're still going to be just like Marvel Unlimited. There's still going to be an app where you have comic book, and I don't know if you're going to continue to have access to the shows or not. But the simple fact is HBO Max launched without a lot of original content, and so since so few people have the DC Universe app, they're just going to move all that content over to HBO Max to give it more value. My understanding is Doom Patrol has done really well on Max, and it's a great show too, by the way. And so they want to move Titans and Swamp Thing and the new Young Justice cartoon over there. Harley Quinn, I'm sure, will end up over there because they need content, and DC Universe has it. So it's not necessarily a failure of the app; it's that they're They're literally absorbing them to try to make HBO Max stronger.
So, do you think, because you're always so doom and gloom about this, so what do you think is going to happen to print comic books, dude? Do you think they're literally just going to eventually make, like, DC's going to present, they're only going to publish like 10 comic book, 5 Batman, 4 Superman, and like a random, and that's all? They're just going to do that in perpetuity and have the rest of their ideas. Or, I mean, so like you brought up animation, for example, it's probably cheaper to make a fucking cartoon than it is to make a comic book, right? Like these studios churn these cartoons out like it's nothing. Like you look at Netflix. Netflix has more cartoons right now than probably most TV combined, and it's all like the same 2 or 3 animation studios. All the shit looks exactly the same. They got all the exact same voices. Dude, they're churning these things out like crazy. Some of these shows have like 3 seasons worth of, and it's just like, how did you come up with this? And it's because it's so cheap. You know what I mean? Like they're probably writing these scripts in 10 minutes and just sending them off, and they're getting churned out in a week. Like it's outrageous. So that could be what it is. Maybe it goes from, you know what, we're not going to make comic books anymore. Cartoons going to YouTube or our streaming network. That's going to be our new comic book, and we'll just get a lot of these comic book writers. Guess what? Now you're cartoon writers and artists. Well, go do whatever you're gonna do. I don't know what artists would do. Maybe they do designs and storyboarding initially, and then it just goes off to some studio that just churns these things out. And then once they have the CGI model set up, they just put it on autopilot. You know what I mean? Like a freaking Paw Patrol, where that shit's just on autopilot. Like it's literally like an AI just writes every single episode now, and it comes out looking exactly the same. Like, I mean, maybe that's where it's going to go.
Well, I dispute the comic books cost shit to produce. You know, the overhead is in all those executives, all those people you need to actually get the comic books produced and to a distributor and to a comic book shop. That's where your overhead is. The actual production of comic books, considering the pittance that creators are paid, it doesn't cost anything. I think the main problem there is that it's older creators playing to an older demographic and a very white skewing demographic. They don't have broad spectrum appeal, okay? And you have to have those structures to get the comic books produced. That costs a ton of money. But if you're producing content that isn't in line with your vision for the characters, and if you can, you know, if a comic book sells, like let's say you sell 20,000 to 40,000 copies of a floppy, and you're able to sell another, 40,000 copies of a graphic novel, or you put a more substantial investment into an animated show that's going to be seen by a minimum of a few 100,000 people, and those few 100,000 people are going to be more likely to buy items at, like, say, a big department store or off of Amazon and wear those items, as opposed to, again, this very niche group that, they're going to want the Joker Who Laughs shirt. You just get a much bigger bang for your buck. It's not worth the hassle of having a comic book company to get something you can get through animation. And, a lot of people, especially again, going back to the 90s when the industry went bust, tons of comic book artists went into toy design, animation, movie storyboarding, not even necessarily people you would think of, guys like Rudolfo DiMaggio, who was never anything big in the comic book, but I thought he had a great visual storytelling sense. He went off to do storyboards. We were waxing Richard Bennett's car on Spawnometer not that long ago. Do you realize that guy became like one of the premier storyboard artists in movies? Like all the really expensive, like fancy movies by guys like David Fincher. He storyboards for them. So he's like one of the superstar storyboard artists. He storyboarded like the Captain America movie. He storyboarded Civil War. So he's contributing to the look of those movies. So there are places for the peak creators in this industry to go, but there's also only so many spots available to them because they're going to want different kinds of people than the people who produce comic books. So, it might be, again, if you're taking the talent that's currently working at DC and you're moving the places where they have more value to you, and then you're cutting the ones that don't have value to you, that optimizes their investment and minimizes their liability, and you don't have all these sex scandals, and you don't have all these weird comic books that cause them problems. You can vet them more thoroughly if they're going to be an animation, because you're still going to have a production pipeline of months, and you're going to have more oversight of that, and you're going to have a bigger audience for it, and still producing the same kind of fan bases, because animation has the same kind of devoted fan bases that comics have, and a cartoon probably has a longer shelf life and greater value overall than a comic book, in circulation.
I agree, but that makes me sad.
Oh yeah, I love this medium, and I don't think that the art form is going to die, but the problem is the infrastructure isn't there to support an industry that doesn't have a Marvel or a DC. And again, it's just going to get more and more niche, and it might, how we get our comic books, it may change. There may not be physical comic books, or there may just be graphic novels. There may be digital, but this idea of going to a comic book shop every week and buying your comic books, you got to get used to the idea that's not going to continue to be the case, and it's got nothing to do with anybody's politics. It's just the nature of the beast that we're in an industry that never should have survived this long to begin with.
I think there'll still be a few shops around for nostalgia, but not as many shops as we see today. I agree with a lot of what you're saying.
Yeah. Well, I mean, they make a lot of money off the
and that's one thing that I was going to say that too when it comes to the shops that, you're going to have just like, obviously, a bunch of these shops are going to go out of business, but a lot of them already have. But the ones that are left could probably still survive, like you said, Mr. Fixit, on just straight up nostalgia. Because, like, look, you can't go to Amazon and buy this stuff. You can't. Like, that's one thing Amazon just can't do unless they somehow partnered with some national network of comic book stores. But even then, you're still in a way buying from these comic. Like, they have the inventory.
And
Amazon can't acquire.
A lot of these stores, you walk in there and they're going to have stuff that hasn't been produced in years. I mean, figures and T-shirts and all kinds of weird shit. A couple of weeks ago, I went to a comic shop and they were selling they were bars of soap, but in the shapes of ears, like a necklace that you could wear, and it was like from The Walking Dead, which I had never seen anywhere before. And the guy sold it to me for like $3, and I don't even think he knew where he got it from. He threw it up on a shelf. I walked by it. It looked really fucking cool. Picked it up, and like, you're not gonna find something like that without going to like a comic shop and perusing the aisles and finding some little hidden gem that somebody sold 10 years ago, probably.
Right, but as opposed to a major city having 20 comic book stores,
you're gonna have
two. You're gonna have
maybe three,
right?
4, or a chain, kind of like we got a couple of chain ones here that I think they'll survive. But these little ones that I always hear about, where they're like in a strip mall, nah, they won't survive.
Yeah. Anything that's being supported by periodicals and the aging fan base falls by the wayside. But like, going on a year now, there's that comic shop that Mr. Fixit introduced us to, Dimension, and I've been wanting to go there since late last year, and now we're coming up on almost a year since then, because first I didn't make it over there because I didn't feel the need to, and then I couldn't because of the COVID. There's nothing in that store that I probably couldn't get off of eBay or one of the comic book specialty stores that are online and stuff. But
I don't know, dude. I told you, I found that freaking awesome Starlin book that I have never seen in my entire life in the dollar section. And like, I went through like 20 long boxes, and it was like in the 15th long box, and I found 2 copies, one for you, one for me. And I've never seen the book. I was looking for it online, and it turns out that it's a series, but it came out like in the early 80s, late 70s.
Yeah, it reprinted material that Star Reach had done in the 70s. Star Reach magazine published it initially, and then they did the Star Reach Classics at Eclipse as a reprint series.
You're going to tell me you find that on Amazon?
Possibly. I'm pretty sure it's over at mycomicshop.com, but that's not the point. The point is, I don't want to go to Dimensions because there's a particular book I need to get, because I can get that online. I actually want to walk around that store because it's a cool store with lots of cool stuff in it. It's a place, it's a destination, it's a place to take people. I want some of my friends that I was going to get to see at Heroes Con, that's not happening anymore. I want, if they ever come to Texas, to take them to a place like that and see how cool and weird it is and how unusual it is. I think that there's always going to be a demand for a place like a Bedrock City or a Third Planet, where again, you've either got material you can't get anywhere else, or just the fact that you're in a place that has all that stuff. There's still an allure to this physical, mecca of geek stuff. There's a reason, but you have to make it a destination. It can't just be the shop with the quarter bins. Like, there's a shop near me, they've got some statues and they've got supplies for gaming and all that kind of stuff. But, aside from gaming, aside from things like collectible card games and miniatures and stuff, why would you physically go into that shop? I go there maybe once a year at most, just because it's convenient to me. I want to go to a place like Dimensions because it's just cool to be there and see what kind of weird shit you're going to find, because there's just so much stuff there you can never take it all in one go. So
that's why I go to NAMM, because they got shit from almost every decade sitting somewhere in that store, because they never ever throw anything away.
Yeah. Well, and a big part of it is that sometimes you don't know what you want until you see it, and you're not going to necessarily stumble upon that by going through an eBay, series of auction stuff. Sometimes you're just walking around, you see this thing where it's like, holy shit, that's awesome. I didn't know that existed. I would have never thought to put it into a search engine, but I want that now. Or I want to go to that shop and see that thing over and over again every time I go to that shop, because that's one of the cool things at that shop that makes me want to get out and go to that place. So yeah, it's not like fandom was going to die or anything. It's just that, like, what's probably going to happen, Jim Lee was talking about how they're going to cut the line by about a quarter. They're going to have more international content, which I thought was very interesting, because international content means you're getting to take pre-existing materials rather than actually paying new creators to do, stuff for you. And then a lot more digital content, which means we want less physical materials floating around. We want everything to be digital. We're only going to print the stuff that actually has an audience. We're not going to just print stuff and hope for the best. That tells me that they're not serious about comics. And if you're AT&T and you don't want to be in the periodical business, the smart thing to do is, if there's still a market for comic book, you shut down your comic company, you cut all those executives loose, and then you license your books to another company. And you look at somebody like IDW. IDW has a relationship with Marvel. For the longest time, everybody's been waiting for Disney to say, okay, IDW and Boom is going to publish the stuff that we used to publish over at Marvel. You have to wonder, okay, if DC decides they want to, just license their stuff, who does it go to? And one thing that popped up in my mind, DC Collectibles is going to go bye-bye, right? They're just done. That's over with. That is shuttered.
But that's the figures, are there statues, right?
Yeah, they're statues and action figures and stuff like that. You know who's doing their action figures these days?
Todd McFarlane. Yeah.
I mean,
and they're actually pretty sweet.
But I mean, the relationship there, and this is another publisher that's in comics. So who Todd McFarlane shepherding Batman comics as a license? I mean, if the relationship is already there, you never know what that's going to happen. There's obviously going to be talent available if they're cutting back everywhere else. So or maybe it goes to a place like Dark Horse or something. Obviously, you have to find a place for this to go that isn't affiliated with Marvel and Disney. But you do have to start wondering, if things go the way everybody thinks they're going to go, because again, we've been watching for that to happen with Marvel for the longest time. Now we have to watch for it for DC. If they continue to put out some kind of periodicals, well, who is going to be the new Marvel and DC? It's not necessarily you don't have those comic books and you don't still satisfy that fan base. It just means that maybe an independent publisher gets a little bit stronger, hopefully, by having access to those licenses.
So you're saying Image could be licensing Batman one day?
Well, that's the thing that's kind of questionable too, is do you give everything to one company or do you spread it around? Do you have one company do your Batman stuff, another company does your Superman? Make the best people at every company be the ones who do the books associated with your characters. How does that go? It's everything's up in the air because the people who used to make sure that the comic book industry stayed the way that we're used to it are getting shown the door at this point. Right now, the people who are going to be running DC in the short term are Marie Javins, who is old school Marvel, but she's, I understand she's supposed to be pretty cool, and probably maybe the closest we've had to a Jeanette Kahn in a long time. But you've also got Michelle Wells, who comes from children's books, and I understand there's supposed to be more of a focus on kid-centric stuff, kid-friendly stuff. That doesn't mean that you make the whole line kidified, but you do have people, I always loved Jeanette Kahn because she came from outside of comic books and brought a perspective and figured out a way to sell comic books to people that weren't just the hardcore faithful, finding a way to dig out an area of the comic book industry for DC Comics that wasn't already being overrun by Marvel. And you might need that new perspective to produce comic books that have broader appeal. But you definitely don't do it by shrinking it and making comics more narrow and more specific to one tiny little audience. You got to diversify, and certainly the ways in which comic books are transmitted to people, whether it's digital, physical, whatever, you have to rethink how that's going to go because the old ways of doing things are probably not long for this world.
True. I think the one thing they've got going for it, I guess we can use this to kind of wrap this up. The one thing they're going for it is that it still translates really well to all the things that are actually popular now, which is, movies, TV shows. I mean, it's shown that it can do anything. You want to make toys with it, you can make toys with it. You want to make games with it, you can make games with it. You want to make movies with it, you can make movies with it. You want to make action movies, dramas, comedies, we can do comedies. You want to do horror, we can do horror, sci-fi, we got sci-fi. You want to make it on TV, you can do it TV. You want to make it animated, let's make it animated. They can. It's so versatile for what is big right now. I think that's the one thing that may carry it. That this may be it might be their last lifeline. Like if DC keeps continuously putting out bombs and Marvel starts putting out some bomb movies, that may change things quickly. But in the meantime, I think that we're just at another wave, and hopefully they can figure out a way riding this wave to keep the publishing side of it solvent. Right. Well, and I mean that's all we can hope for.
But I really don't think publishing is going to survive. But I think that you're always going to have.
Way to go! What Debbie Downer there at the very end. I was trying to give a little glimmer of hope here at the end.
Let's not even try that. Although, again, if you have more creators free to do the type of work they want to do and the work that they're passionate about, then you might see a renaissance akin to what Marvel had in the 60s when they came at comics from a whole new perspective and got creators that weren't going to get work at a place like DC or Dell to do a whole new different kind of comic book. The one benefit is it gives a lot of creators, and I've been wondering about this for a while because like Steve Orlando's got a big batch of books he's doing over at Image, and it's like, gee, I wonder where he got free time from. Probably because he got freed up from DC, for instance. These guys have an opportunity to do works that could be translated to other media too. They could be the next Gerard Way with an Umbrella Academy, They could be the next Grant Morrison with a Happy. They could be the next Rick Remender with a Deadly Class. There's all these books and all these works that are getting translated because it's so much easier to take a graphic novel and turn that into a movie or a TV show than it is a novel because so much of the visuals are already there to guide people in what to do. And obviously adaptations of comic books have been better over the years because they've been more faithful to the comics while also recognizing what they need to make changes to. Walking Dead, despite, not being what it used to be, was still one of the biggest television series in the world and still does reasonably well and it's still pretty damn faithful to the comic book. So it's not that the art form necessarily dies, but it is going to have to transform into something different because we can't rely rely on Batman to save us every time, but Batman's going to be okay too, because Batman's been making Warner Brothers money since 1966, and Spider-Man's been making Marvel money since the 1970s. And there's even if all the superhero movies collapse, there's going to be a cartoon. You know, I was just thinking the other day, how is it possible that we haven't had a new Superman cartoon show since the 90s? You know, why isn't there more Superman in media like animation? You know, they do the original movies and stuff, but like Superman should have an own cartoon. There should be a cartoon always, just like there's pretty much always a Batman cartoon. You know, if one gets canceled, give it a few minutes, they're going to have another one come out. Those are perennial. Those guys are always going to be safe. They're multimedia titans. They're pop cultural titans. You don't need physical comic books for that to be maintained, because comic books haven't been relevant to that for a long ass time anyway. You may miss out on a Court of Owls, but may actually get better cartoons that are able to do something like Court of Owls, because the creators have the freedom to not be married to a freaking periodical that 20,000 people bother to read. So there's still going to be comic books. It's just we're going to have to think about what it means to be a comic book and what a comic book is and how you get a comic book. And also recognize that your beloved, Wolverine, there's always going to be a place for him somewhere in cartoons and in movies. I mean, hell, they just cut a deal at DC with Spotify. They're going to start producing scripted, audio adventures. You know, there's always going to be a place for these characters. It's just you're going to have to maybe expand your mindset about what is valid, what's canon, and how you want to receive these concepts.
I was actually going to say that. I was like, maybe they'll go to Audible, and then you just.
Well, no, I was going to say I just listened to the Sandman audio book.
Mm-hmm.
That's all right.
Well, the story they're adapting isn't very good.
The hype, people were like, "It's amazing!" And I'm like, "It's all right. It was okay." I mean, 10 hours, but it was okay. I wasn't blown away, I did like the old timey radio, the sound effects, and though it did get annoying because every time they changed the stories, they would do this, the Sandman, and then they did this whole intro over and over, I guess, between each story, which got a little repetitive. But besides that, it was all right. I could see comics going in that direction. It was pretty interesting.
Yeah, well, the problem is that my understanding is they're adapting Preludes and Nocturnes, and pretty much everybody's like, oh yeah, that's before Neil Gaiman figured out what he was going to be doing with Sandman. It was The Doll's House and then Season of Mists, where it actually started to become Sandman that everybody knows and at that one time loved. So yeah, I would listen to another book. I mean, I enjoyed it. But real quick, do you think, because when you mentioned earlier The Walking Dead, do you think they'll end the series where they'll talk about season 13 and then it never comes out? What do you mean?
Like they did with the book?
Oh no. You
don't think they're done like that? You don't think they got the balls be like, wait till season 13 and then they do like the last episode where everyone fucking dies and they're like, oh yeah, by the way, there's no season 13?
Nope. Because the problem is,
man, I wish they would.
It would be ballsy, but the problem is they're still going to be repackaging that show for audiences for years to come, and you've got to leave them with that. There's always going to be another story. There's always going to be more Walking Dead someday, even if we end the series.
Oh yeah, there's Fear the Walking Dead now? That's supposed to be pretty good.
Yeah, I heard that it was really good for a little while there. They moved the person who was show running that to the main show, and then Fear the Walking Dead, I think, went to shit again.
All right, okay. I haven't seen Walking Dead since like season 3, so shit. I have no idea about the show.
There's a lot of good seasons, but
I read the book.
Yeah. There was some really good stuff in the shows though, but yeah, once they got to Glenn getting his head bashed in, I was done with the TV show. Just like I should have been done with the books if I had been smart enough to see where the winds were blowing.
All right, guys. So hey, all is lost. All is lost.
Abandon all hope. He who enters.
Sidebar. Hey, where's the best place to go buy like back issues online other than eBay?
I just because I like supporting Texas companies, and because they've got a really good selection. I say mycomicshop.com, which in physical location is Lone Star Comics out in Austin. They've got a really good selection. The interface is very hospitable, and they've got pretty damn reasonable prices. Shipping could be better, but otherwise it's pretty good. Mile High, of course, has the largest selection, but they've got some weird price structures, and basically you have to kind of get into their club and wait for sales and e-coupons and shit like that. You can't just go in there and buy what you want and move along, so that's kind of an issue. But for me, I just prefer mycomicshop.com.
Yeah, because I saw some guys trying to push like the first appearance of that Punchline character, and they're like already saying the book's worth $100, and I'm like, it came out 4 months ago.
It's whatever you can con people into paying. But I'll tell you this: I haven't heard any human being say a goddamn thing about Punchline. I've seen the hype and stuff, and I've read some articles on this character, but I haven't heard from a single person about how awesome this character is. It really feels poochy to me. It really feels like we're just going to make Harley Quinn, and it's not that easy, guys. It was never that easy.
Harley Quinn was lightning in a bottle.
She's she feels very fetch to me. Okay, that doesn't go over. Okay, they're trying to make fetch happen. Fetch isn't going to happen.
Wow, we're talking about a fucking episode killer. Okay, well, hey guys, that was edit something with this. If everybody wants to subscribe to Diabolu Frank's Doom and Gloom, you can catch him on Twitter at Diabolu Frank.
Actually, no, I'm not at Diabolu Frank. I'm at Commander Blank.
Oh, at Commander Blanks. My bad. It probably pops up either way. At Commander Blanks.
Actually, I really haven't done much with Twitter recently.
How do I say goodbye to what we had? The good times that made us laugh outweigh the bad. I thought we'd get to see forever, but forever's gone away. It's so hard to say goodbye to yesterday. The 108th Sage, Alan Middleton, ask what would Wonder Woman do? Biko Django, Chris Dunford, who added thanks RSP, as always, you rock my small, self-centered universe, Chris Lydon, Chris Thompson, Debask, Dr. Ange, Dr. Pop Culture BGSU who added socially and emotionally distant, Dick Ashton, who added thank you RSP, El Romero Moro, Fanholes Podcast, Guido, Guy not Guy, The Hammer Strikes, Random Geeky Stuff, History of Comics on Film, I Was Joe Crawford, Jeffrey Brown, John from Married with Comics Podcasts, Just in Time with the J&T Baggers, Justice Trek 2020, KSCGSF Podcast, Keith G. Baker, Longbox Crusade, Michael Wagner, Mike at Send Aliens to Me, Min, Nethead, Paul K. Bisson, Pensador Comic, Philip McCalery, Pop Culture Affidavit, Ramstree Ragabush, Richard G., who added thanks for the inclusion, we love the long box lingo, Robert Speculum Fight, Roger Preby, Ryan Daly, Satin Tights, A Wonder Woman Podcast, Secret Wars and Beyond Podcast, Sean Phillips, Siskoid, Son of Cthulhu, Tim Price, The Pod Crusher, Trekker Talk, Warlord Worlds, Wonder Woman, Warrior for Peace Podcast, and Xenozoic Cinephiles.
One of the main reasons why you have a Snyder cut, the guy, he got cut too.
Oh, that's.
I'm telling you, it has
funny,
to. It has to do gangbusters to fucking prove its worth.
How's it going to do to gangbusters?
You know what's funny though is that there is no definition of gangbusters anymore. Like, because we don't know what these streaming services. We don't.
You don't know their numbers.
There's no Nielsen rating to compare anything. Nobody fucking knows because they're getting paid a subscription fee. So they're already winning with depending on how many subscribers they have. You know what I mean? Like I'm sure they have an internal metric that says, oh, it's time to cancel the show, or the show was good. Let's do this again. But for the most part, like, I don't know. You know what I mean? Like, no, that's why people get pissed off when their shows are getting, oh, we really love this show. We got canceled off Netflix. Well, it's like, we don't know what their justification was, but I'm sure they had one. Yeah, it's really strange. These are confusing times.
Netflix had a little bit of a formula for a while there. Basically, everything got 3 seasons because the way that the contracts in television were structured, you got bumps after a certain number of seasons. And so they were always canceling the show before the bump because they didn't want to pay any more for it than they were already paying. And I assume if you got something like a runaway hit like a Stranger Things, it's worth it for them to go past that point. But yeah, there's a question about the values. Like, okay, like look at something like One Day at a Time. You know, obviously there was a groundswell of support for that show, and so you ended up with like Legacy Media. I think like one of the smaller cable outfits ended up picking it up and continuing it without having access to any of the Netflix material. In part because Netflix wants that Legacy to attract subscribers to them in reverse. To see the earlier episodes. So again, as you said, who the fucking knows? It's just like Netflix is always
I wonder how their deal with Lucifer worked out, where they own like the last 3 seasons, but the first 3 seasons belong to Fox technically,
right?
Or whoever produced it. But then it's a DC book, and Lucifer actually makes an appearance in the DC crossover, so he's part of canon. So it's like that's a really fucking weird one there.
Right. Well, and again, that incentivizes the other shows to go on to Netflix. So it's sort of like the conceptual anchor baby. It's like, okay, we'll do a few more seasons, and well, you want all the seasons to be on the same streaming system, right? Well, then you're gonna have to come over to Netflix. I know you've got your HBO Max, but really you need to have the rest of that series with us. Or they'll have to come to us to finish it.
It's smart for them to kind of spread it out and rent it out to other companies to have it on their streaming, because if they have it all in one basket, I mean, I just don't have the desire to go to HBO Max right now.
Well, HBO Max is great, but the fact is we have cable and we get it for free, so we're not subscribers ourselves. ourselves. It just comes with our cable. I don't know if I would necessarily be cool with us paying for that, even though they've got a good selection.
I still haven't watched it.
There's plenty of good. Well, I mean, you're gonna want. Well, are you still watching like Harley Quinn on like YouTube clips and shit?
No, I watch it on. He has the DC thing.
Okay, so you've got the DC Universe app anyway. So
he had the DC Universe. So I would watch it on that, and now that's HBO Max, I'll probably watch that. I do want to watch that the Cthulhu series.
Oh yeah, I didn't realize that it finally premiered last night. So hopefully later in the week we'll start watching that.
Yeah, I heard the first episode was great. The people that I follow, they were just like, it's fantastic.
Yeah,
so
I've been looking forward to that one. Yeah, but I've let a lot of stuff fall by the wayside in terms of TV viewing and stuff. So I really want to jump on that now before it gets too far, and then I'm like, I gotta watch a whole season. So I need to watch it as it comes out. The preceding program is a non-profit fan production. Any copyrighted materials contained therein are believed borrowed under fair use with no copyright infringement intended. Please feel free to leave comments at Rolled Spines Productions WordPress blog. You can also send us Twitter comments through the Rolled Spine Podcast Twitter. Thank you for listening.